betrayal, and redemption. Canta de Mio Cid. The earliest surviving epic poem in Spanish literature, Canta de Mio Cid tells of the exploits of the real-life Castilian hero El Cid in the attempt to recapture Spain from the Moors. The poem focuses on military and diplomatic prowess as well as El Cid's relationship with King Alfonso VI, using a realist tone to describe the hero's efforts to regain lost honor. The authorship of the epic, which may have been intended for public recital, has never been established. The only surviving manuscript is signed per Abbas, but the identity of the writer has never been verified. The Tale of Igor's Campaign. An anonymous epic poem in the Old East Slavic language, the Tale of Igor's Campaign describes an unsuccessful raid by a prince of the land of the Rus, named Igor Sviatoslavich. Igor's heroic pride leads him to face overwhelming odds, and he is taken captive by his enemies, but escapes. The tale has elements of both epic and lyric, with political overtones too. It has become a Russian national classic. Lives are laid out on the threshing floor, souls are winnowed from bodies. The Tale of Igor's Campaign. Nibelungenlied. The main characters of this work have become internationally known through Wagner's Ring cycle of operas. The Nibelungenlied, or Song of the Nibelungs, is a richly imagined anonymous epic poem in Middle High German. Medieval German literature had turned to courtly refinement, but the Nibelungenlied looked back to older, more visceral notions of honor and vengeance. It tells of stolen treasure and magic powers, of the dragonslayer Siegfried and his wooing of the princess Kriemhild, and of Kriemhild's revenge against the Nibelungen after the murder of Siegfried by one of their most prominent warriors, the king's brother Hagen. Some characters, including the powerful Queen Brunhild, and some of the narrative are rooted in Old Norse sagas. Romance of the Rose. Guillaume de Loris and Jean de Meun. Frenchman Guillaume de Loris wrote 4,058 lines of the Romance of the Rose. Jean de Meun took it to more than 21,000 lines. Based on Ovid's Ars Amatoria, the poem is one of the most popular French examples of the late Middle Ages. It is a dream allegory of the wooing of a young lady, symbolized by a rosebud, within courtly society, represented by the garden. De Meun gives opinions on topics of the day. The first 1,705 lines were rendered into English by Geoffrey Chaucer. Cantigas de Santa Maria. Alfonso X. One of the largest collections of medieval solo songs, the Cantigas de Santa Maria, were written in medieval Galician Portuguese, probably by Alfonso X, King of Castile, Leon, and Galicia. Every song, or canticle, refers to the Virgin Mary, whose miracles, including local events prompted by her intercession, provide narrative content. Every 10th song is a hymn in her honor. The songs, written with musical notation, have great metrical variety, with lines ranging from 2 to 24 syllables. Alfonso X. Born in 1221 in Burgos, the capital of Castile, Alfonso X was a scholarly and wise king who encouraged learning and the arts. His reign began in 1252 following the death of his father Ferdinand III, who had greatly expanded Castile and fought the most successful campaigns of the Reconquista against the Moors. Inheriting a wealthy and stable land, Alfonso commissioned and personally oversaw a range of texts, from law and astronomy to music and history, ensuring that Castilian would be the forerunner of modern Spanish. He died in Seville in 1284. Key works. 1252, 84 Cantigas de Santa Maria c.1255, 65 Siete Partidas. 1264 Primera Chronica General. Introduction. From the early 14th century, the cultural movement known as the Renaissance began to spread across Europe from the Italian city of Florence. It was marked by a change from medieval attitudes, which were dominated by the dogma of the Christian Church, to a far more humanist perspective that was inspired by a rediscovery of ancient Greek and Roman philosophy and culture. But this was more than a simple rebirth of classical ideas. the period was also a time of innovation. The epic and the everyday. In literature, although inspiration came from classical style and forms, writers chose to work in vernacular languages, as opposed to Latin or Greek, and to create their own stories rather than retell those of the past. Among the first to write in this way was the Florentine poet Dante Alighieri, whose The Divine Comedy was not only an epic poetic journey through the afterlife but also served as an allegory for the contemporary world. At the same time, other writers chose to turn away from the realm of epics and legends altogether, and focus on the lives, autonomy, and ingenuity of ordinary people. In the Decameron, published in 1353, Giovanni Boccaccio presented a collection of 100 novellas, in prose in the Florentine vernacular. Shortly afterwards Geoffrey Chaucer wrote a similar collection of stories, the Canterbury Tales. Both works contained a variety of tales of everyday life, from love stories to moral parables. With their discussions of human vices, accounts of licentiousness, and bawdy practical jokes, they soon became popular reading. The birth of the novel. In the 15th century, the invention of Gutenberg's printing press hastened the spread of ideas, and this technology also made it easier to cater to audiences in vernacular languages. Popular demand for books had been stimulated in particular by the prose storytelling of Boccaccio and Chaucer. From these early stories emerged a form of literature as a long, prose narrative that is now ubiquitous, but was then very much novel. During the 16th century, prose narratives gradually replaced the epic poem as the predominant literary form in most of Europe, and readers particularly responded to humorous stories, such as François Rabelais' satirical adventures of Gargantua and Pantagruel. Miguel de Cervantes of Spain continued in this tradition, albeit with a gentler wit, in Don Quixote. However, Cervantes' satire about chivalry has a more serious undercurrent, and rather than a hero, the eponymous knight is depicted as all too human. Don Quixote is often considered to be the first modern novel, or at least the first European novel. China's 4 great classical novels and Japan's The Tale of Genji were all written much earlier. Life on stage and page. In England, the prose narrative took longer to capture popular attention. Poets such as Edmund Spenser and John Milton continued to reinterpret the epic poem, but it was the theatre that most attracted the public. The plays of Christopher Marlowe and Ben Jonson built on the ideas of Greek tragedy and comedy with their dramas, but even they were eclipsed by Shakespeare's mastery of the form, which allowed him to depict very human characters in a catalogue of comedies, histories, and tragedies. Novels began to appear in England soon after Shakespeare, and rapidly overtook the theatre in popularity. From the start, English novelists such as Daniel Defoe and Henry Fielding presented believable characters in their novels, which contain vivid descriptions of time and place that give the works a degree of realism. Defoe's Robinson Crusoe professes to be a true autobiographical account. Both Lawrence Sterne's comic Tristram Shandy and Jonathan Swift's fantastical Gulliver's Travels also use the autobiographical voice, but do so in ways that test the reader's willingness to believe the narrator. In 17th-century France, the theatre was also at the heart of literature, and was even more indebted to classical models than in England, with Jean Racine and Pierre Corneille striving to follow the rules of Greek drama. However, the public tended to call the tune, and it was Molière's comedies of manners that seemed more in keeping with the times. Poking fun at the contemporary mores continued to be a part of the French literary scene in the 18th century, with Enlightenment philosophers such as Voltaire wittily satirizing the conventions of the establishment. In context. Focus. Post-classical epic before 800 BCE. Ancient Greek poet Homer writes his epic Odyssey, which influences much of Western literature. 19 BCE. The Aeneid is written in Latin by the Roman poet Virgil. It will become a model for Latin epics of the medieval period. After 1572 Luís de Camões's Portuguese epic poem The Lusíads follows in Dante's tradition, weaving together fiction, history, and politics in a story of Portugal's voyages of discovery. 1667 The last great epic poem to be written in English, Paradise Lost by John Milton, reflects Britain's emerging role as a world power. The epic was the literary form of choice for some of antiquity's greatest poets. Epics were written to celebrate the achievements of a hero, often part divine or possessed of exceptional strength and valor, and the stories were often allegories of transitional moments in history, such as the birth of a nation or the conquest of an enemy. For example, while Homer's Iliad is the story of the hero Achilles, it is also, more importantly, about the defeat of Troy by the great armies of Greece. Such poems often weave together the contemporary with the mythic, and their heroes play key roles in building civilization. Long after the fall of classical civilizations, the epic poem remained the favored literary form through which to celebrate national power. For example, English poet Edmund Spenser's 1590 epic The Faerie Queene is a paean to the ascendancy of Elizabeth I in her country, while Italian Ludovico Ariosto's Orlando Furioso, written in 1516, applauds the increasingly influential house of Este. Dante's Hell is situated below the city of Jerusalem and is shaped like a gigantic funnel that leads to the very center of the earth. Outside Hell is a vestibule containing the souls of those who in life did neither good nor evil. Hell proper is made up of 9 circles, which contain the souls of sinners, from the least offensive to the most offensive. A wall, guarded by devils, impedes Dante's progress to lower hell, where violent and malicious sinners are punished. At hell's core, trapped in ice, is a winged, 3-faced Satan. A divine epic. Dante's The Divine Comedy fits into the post-classical epic tradition. It is long, heroic, allegorical, and often nationalistic, reflecting Dante's active role in Florentine politics. However, it is also unusual and innovative in a variety of ways. Whereas in earlier epics the omniscient narrator remained outside the story, Dante sets the narrator within the text. The book audaciously uses Tuscan vernacular language rather than traditional Latin. And Dante stretches the form of the epic by combining classical thought and mythological motifs with contemporary European philosophy and Christian symbolism. Dante takes the reader on a journey through hell, purgatory, and heaven, from sin and despair to ultimate salvation, mapping out the geography of each realm in detail, evoking an almost physical reality. The work recalls many classical epics that describe journeys to the underworld and, like earlier epics, it is an allegory. The journey through the underworld is symbolic of Dante's search for personal meaning. Originally, Dante called this poem simply the Commedia, or comedy, which at the time was a term used for works in which the difficulties or challenges faced by the protagonist were resolved in a broadly happy ending. It was the 14th-century poet Giovanni Boccaccio who first called the poem divine, a reflection on its spiritual content as well as the extreme beauty of its style. Purgatory is a mountain of stepped terraces where the souls of the penitent undergo a different kind of suffering on each level to purge themselves of sin and enter the earthly paradise. Politics and poetry. When Dante began the Divine Comedy, a work that was to take him 12 years to complete, he was already established as a poet, working in the Dolce Stil Novo, a movement characterized by its introspection and liberal use of metaphor and symbolism. Politics and personal passions were the subjects of his poetry, and late 13th century Italy provided plenty of inspiration. Dante himself was embroiled in the political life of his beloved Florence, which was involved, along with the rest of Italy, in struggles for power between the church and the state. Key figures from these conflicts were portrayed in the Divine Comedy, and the inclusion of real people provided a degree of sensationalism that contributed to the poem's success. Dante was eventually exiled from Florence for his political allegiances and, although it greatly pained him, his removal from public affairs allowed him the distance to produce his celebrated allegory of the philosophy, morals, and beliefs of his medieval world. The Divine Comedy is structured in thirds, reflecting the significance of the number 3 in Christian theology. The journey comprises 3 books, each with 33 cantos, or chapters, plus 1 introductory chapter, to make 100 cantos in total. It is written in a verse style called terza rima, an interlocking 3-line rhyme scheme, which was developed by Dante. Told from a first-person perspective, the work is in the form of an eschatological journey. The story begins in a dark forest, a symbol of sinful life on earth. Dante attempts to climb a mountain to find his way out of the forest, but his path is blocked by wild animals. Hopeless, weak, and in need of spiritual guidance, he meets the Roman poet Virgil, who has been sent to guide him by Beatrice, the lost love of his past. For Dante, Virgil represents classical thinking, reason, and poetry. Virgil assures Dante he will achieve salvation, but only after he has journeyed through the afterlife. The two then begin their journey, starting with the descent into hell. There is no greater sorrow than to recall happiness in times of misery. The Divine Comedy. Journey to the Afterlife. The first book of the Divine Comedy describes the levels of hell, and the ways in which punishments are tailored to the sins of individuals. The souls of flatterers, for example, spend eternity buried in excrement, a reminder of the excrement that they spoke on earth. Seducers are tormented by horned devils who crack their whips over them until they become lumps of well-beaten flesh. In his visceral descriptions of the punishments and layout of hell, Dante invites readers to reflect on their own failings, to change direction, and to live in harmony with other people and with God. When their journey to the bottommost reaches of hell is complete, Dante and Virgil begin the ascent of Mount Purgatory, with its circular terraces. Purgatory is a place for sinners who lived selfishly on earth, but showed enough remorse to offer hope for salvation. In purgatory, they may purge themselves in preparation for entering heaven. As they climb the mountain, passing through 7 levels representing the 7 deadly sins, Dante and Virgil meet individuals painfully working to overcome the flaws that led to their sins. Proud souls, for example, carry huge stones on their backs while they learn humility. Once out of purgatory, Beatrice takes over as Dante's guide. This is because Virgil was born before Christ and therefore could not enter the blessed realms. Beatrice can be seen as the eternal feminine guide, the heart and soul of humankind. It is she who intervenes for Dante's salvation, and through her, Dante comes to understand the love of God. Dante's legacy. Dante adapted the form of the classical epic, with its adventurer heroes and multiple gods, to express a profound vision of Christian destiny, incorporating both personal and historical events into the story. Innumerable artists and writers have been inspired by the Divine Comedy, and American-born writer T.S. Eliot described it as the highest point that poetry has ever reached or ever can reach. Dante journeys through heaven's 9 spheres, each of which is linked with a celestial body, in line with medieval earth-centric ideas about the structure of the universe, and with the hierarchy of angels. Beyond the spheres is God in the Empyrean, a heaven beyond time and space. Dante Alighieri. A politician, writer, and philosopher, Durante degli Alighieri was born in Florence, Italy, in 1265 to a wealthy family with a long history of involvement in Florentine politics. Dante was betrothed to be married in 1277, but he had already fallen in love with another girl, Beatrice Bice Portinari, who became his muse and to whom he dedicated many love poems. Tragically, she died suddenly in 1290. So grief-stricken was Dante that he immersed himself in political life, becoming a priori in 1300 and acting as envoy to Pope Boniface VIII during upheavals in Florence. While he was in Rome, his enemies gained power and Dante was exiled from Florence, never to return. It is not known exactly when he began work on the Divine Comedy, but it may have been as early as 1304. Dante died in Ravenna, Italy, in 1321. Other key works. 1294 La Vita Nuova 1303 on the eloquence of vernacular. 1308 Convivio. See also, Aeneid Odyssey The Fairy Queen The Lusíads Paradise Lost The Red Room The Waste Land. In context. Focus. China's four great classical novels after 14th century. The second great classical novel, The Water Margin by Shernayan, is the story of a band of outlaws who oppose a corrupt ruler. 16th century. The third great classical novel, Journey to the West, by Wu Cheng'en, tells of a Buddhist monk's pilgrimage from China to India. See point 1618. Some scholars consider The Plum in the Golden Vase, its author unknown, to be the fourth Chinese classical novel. Although hugely popular, it was suppressed because of its overt sensual realism. See point 1791. The generally accepted fourth great classical novel, Dream of the Red Chamber by Chao Shuoqin, focuses on the rise and fall of an aristocratic family. As the first of China's four great classical novels, Romance of the Three Kingdoms is a hugely significant and influential work of literature. As with the other three works, The Water Margin, Journey to the West, and Dream of the Red Chamber, it marked a radical departure from the high style of Chinese poetic and philosophical literature. Aimed at an audience of common people, it employed techniques akin to oral storytelling, such as the use of vernacular language and songs, and addressed the reader directly. Despite being heavily based on historical texts, Romance of the Three Kingdoms is recognizably a novel. It is a feat of imaginative writing sustained over 800,000 words in translation, and featuring more than 1,000 characters. The first novel? The book describes the collapse of China's Han dynasty into three kingdoms in the 3rd century CE, and the 111 years of warfare that followed. Written over 1,000 years after the events it describes, it takes as its historical inspiration the history of the Three Kingdoms, written in the 4th century CE. Scholars believe that Romance of the Three Kingdoms was written nearly 250 years before Don Quixote, which is often regarded as the first great European novel. But, perhaps surprisingly, this early Chinese classic did not spark a profusion of prose literature. Indeed, the four great classics were published over a period of 400 years. However, Romance of the Three Kingdoms has enduring appeal. It has never been out of print, and its scenes are so well known that they are familiar to Chinese speakers who have not even read the book. Its success is partly assured by its conventional, conservative narrative. Villains always get their comeuppance, and order is always restored. One of the major themes of the book is loyalty. In perhaps the most famous scene, The Oath in the Peach Garden, future ruler Liu Bei persuades two men to join him in an oath of fraternity, thereby going against what was at the time society's strongest bond, unquestioning loyalty to family. It is a powerful scene that has been invoked by Chinese societies and fraternities of all kinds ever since. Despite the popularity of Romance of the Three Kingdoms, the other classics have not been quite so widely read. Nevertheless, all four have continued to be enjoyed and studied, and are regarded as the pinnacles of popular Chinese literature. Many editions of Romance of the Three Kingdoms were richly illustrated, which helped to make the text and stories accessible to ordinary Chinese people, not just the elite. Luo Guanzhong. Although his existence is not in question, very little else can be confirmed about the life of Luo Guanzhong. He is traditionally regarded as the author of the first of China's four great classical novels, Romance of the Three Kingdoms, and co-author or editor of the second, The Water Margin. He is also thought to have written story collections that deal with China's dynastic past, including the fantastical tale The Three Sui Quashed the Demon's Revolt. But in 14th century China, attributing authorship to one person may in fact denote that they were the chief compiler and editor of a large number of texts by earlier storytellers. Other key works. The Water Margin, The Three Sui Quashed the Demon's Revolt. The end of the Tang dynasty and the period of the Five Dynasties. Chronicle of the Sui and Tang dynasty. See also, the Tale of Genji. In context. Focus. The frame narrative before. C.8th, 13th century 1001 Nights, a collection of tales by different authors from across the Islamic world, is framed within the story of Scheherazade. 1348-53 The Decameron, by Italian Giovanni Boccaccio, contains 100 stories set within a tale of people fleeing the Black Death. After 1558 The Heptameron, by French author Marguerite de Navarre, contains 72 short stories, framed within a story of 10 stranded travelers. 2004 English writer David Mitchell's Cloud Atlas follows the frame narrative tradition, including stories within stories that travel over centuries. The use of an outer narrative that envelopes within it a story is a long-established literary device. Frame narratives provide context and structure for a tale and often include a narrator, or narrators, who can help engage the reader directly. 1001 Nights successfully employed this technique, as did Giovanni Boccaccio in his Decameron. Although most earlier works used the frame narrative to hold stories around a single theme, often religion, Geoffrey Chaucer used it to far more colorful effect in the Canterbury Tales, opening up the narrative to include a range of personalities, whose stories encompass diverse themes. Early editions of the Canterbury Tales contained woodcuts to help make the text more accessible to a wide range of readers. Shown here are the pilgrims sharing a meal. Later works of the genre include Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights and Arthur Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes detective stories. The technique is still in use, and many works of modernist and postmodernist fiction play with framing narratives, for example Italo Calvino's If on a Winter's Night a Traveler. The device is also often used in plays and films. Literary innovation. Chaucer probably began writing the Canterbury Tales in about 1387, during a brief absence from his official court duties and career as a civil servant. It marked a significant change in his literary direction. His other poems, including his first major work in Troilus and Chryside, his retelling of the love story set during the Siege of Troy, were mainly concerned with courtly themes and written primarily to be heard by court audiences. The Canterbury Tales, however, was written for a far wider audience, who were probably intended to read the work rather than just listen to it. The text is written in Middle English, as opposed to the Latin or French that was commonly used for courtly poetry of the time. Chaucer was not the first to do this, but it has been argued that he played a major role in popularizing the use of the vernacular in English literature. Significantly, too, the Canterbury Tales paints a remarkable picture of late medieval English society, depicting men and women of all classes, from the nobility through to the laboring classes. At NYGHT was come into that hostile rye WEL 9 and 20 in a campaign of Sondre folk. The Canterbury Tales. Sondre folk. The Canterbury Tales opens with a general prologue that sets the scene and creates a framework for the tales that follow. The frame story concerns a group of 29 pilgrims on their way to the shrine of St. Thomas Becket in Canterbury Cathedral, in southern England. The pilgrims meet at the Tabard Inn, in Southwark, near London, where the narrator, Geoffrey Chaucer, joins them. Pilgrimages were an everyday occurrence in medieval Europe, and Chaucer describes the pilgrims as Sondre folk, people of all social classes and occupations. Most of the general prologue, which consists of 858 lines of verse, describes the pilgrims, their social class, clothing, and personalities. Having introduced the pilgrims, or most of them, the prologue ends with the innkeeper, or host, a man called Harry Bailey, suggesting a competition. He proposes that each of the pilgrims should tell 4 tales, 2 on the outward journey and 2 on their return. The teller of the best tale will be rewarded with a free meal, paid for by the other pilgrims, when they return to the inn. The pilgrims draw lots and it is decided that the knight will tell the first story. The tales. The 24 tales within the framework include 2 related by the narrator, or Chaucer himself. Most are written in rhyming couplets, a few in prose. They vary enormously because Chaucer made use of a wide range of themes and literary styles. These include animal and other fables, fabliaux, romantic verse, pious homilies, sermons, allegories, and exempla. Where the Knight's Tale is a romance, which tells of a love rivalry between two brothers, the Miller's Tale is bawdy and comic, taking as its theme the cuckolding of an Oxford carpenter. The raucous and vulgar Summoner's Tale includes a description of a friar being tricked into accepting a fart as payment, while, in contrast, the Second Nun's Tale is the story of Saint Cecilia, a deeply spiritual woman martyred for her faith. The tales vary considerably in length. One of the longest, and perhaps the best known, is The Wife of Bath's Tale. This begins with a prologue developing the wife's character, domineering and pleasure-seeking, before continuing with her account of her eventful life with 5 husbands, the theme being women's mastery over men. This world nigh's but a thoroughfare full of woe. The Canterbury Tales. A colorful picture. Chaucer brings each story to life by ensuring that the tone and style are appropriate to each respective storyteller, reflecting his or her own status, occupation, and character. The vividness is enhanced by the use of the framing devices, which link the stories to one another through dialogue and interactions among the characters. The storytellers frequently interrupt each other with arguments, insults, or sometimes even praise. The Prioress's Tale, for example, begins after the host has politely invited the prioress to tell her story, while on another occasion, the knight interrupts the monk because he finds his tale too miserable. The wider framing story adds a further dimension to the individual tales. The Canterbury Tales presents a colorful picture of late medieval England, its people and events. Chaucer was living and writing during a particularly turbulent period. The Black Death of 1348-49 had killed a third of the population, the Peasants' Revolt of 1381 had demonstrated cracks in the feudal system, and the authority of the Church was being questioned, not least for its corrupt practices. Chaucer's tales reflect many of these events, often mocking and satirizing the hypocrisy of the Church. In the Pardoner's Tale, the pardoner is shown to be guilty of the very sins he is preaching against, while the Friar's Tale is a satirical attack on summoners, ecclesiastical officers whose role was to summon to court sinful members of the diocese. It is not surprising that the Summoner's Tale is an attack on friars. The Ellesmere manuscript is a beautiful, exquisitely illuminated copy of the Canterbury Tales and is the basis for most modern versions of Chaucer's text. Unfinished work. Chaucer borrowed from numerous sources when writing the Canterbury Tales. The Knight's Tale is based on Boccaccio's epic poem Teseida, and there are other references within the tales to Boccaccio's work. Chaucer's other sources included Ovid, the Bible, chivalric works such as Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, and, possibly, works by his friend the English poet John Gower. Scholars do not know what Chaucer's final intention was for the Canterbury Tales, nor even the order in which he wished the tales to appear, or whether the work was finished. The only clue is in the general prologue, with its plan for the pilgrims to tell 4 stories each. However, there are only 24 tales, so not all the pilgrims tell even one tale. Nor do any of the storytellers or the host indicate the sequence or numbering of any tale. For though we sleep or wake, or roam, or ride, I fleeth the time, it nyl no man abide. The Canterbury Tales. Enduring masterpiece. Evidence indicates that Chaucer was still working on the tales when he died. There is no original manuscript in his own hand, instead there are fragments that would have been scribed by someone else. The earliest is the Hengert manuscript, produced shortly after Chaucer's death. The sequence most commonly used today, however, is based on the 15th century Ellesmere manuscript, which divides the text into 10 fragments, containing varying numbers of tales. The tales are grouped according to clues or links within the text, and end with the Parson's Tale, a long prose sermon on the 7 deadly sins. This is followed by Chaucer's Retraction, a curious apology in which the author asks forgiveness for the vulgar, secular elements of his works. The exact significance of this apology is unclear, although some have seen it as a deathbed repentance. Despite the uncertainty surrounding its structure and plot, the Canterbury Tales is recognized as a masterpiece, and one of the most important literary works in the English language. Its humor, bawdiness, pathos, and satirical observations remain unequaled today, more than 600 years after it was written. Geoffrey Chaucer. Not just a great English poet but also a courtier, civil servant, and diplomat, Chaucer was probably born in London around 1343. His father, a wine merchant, was keen to advance his son's career and secured a place for him as a page in the Countess of Ulster's household. From there, Chaucer entered the service of Edward III, first as a soldier, then as a diplomat, traveling to France and Italy, where he would have read the works of Dante and Boccaccio. From 1374 to 1386 he held a post as Controller of Customs. Chaucer married in 1366, and gained a patron, John of Gaunt, the king's fourth son. Chaucer wrote his first major poem, Book of the Duchess, as an elegy to Gaunt's first wife, Blanche. He fell on hard times during Richard II's reign, however, in 1389 was appointed clerk of the king's royal building projects. He died in 1400 and was buried in Westminster Abbey. Other key works. 1379 The House of Fame c. 1385 Troilus and Chryside. c. 1388 The Legend of Good Women. See also, 1001 Nights The Decameron Wuthering Heights The Hound of the Baskervilles If on a Winter's Night a Traveller The Blind Assassin. In context. Focus. Renaissance humanism before 1304. 74 Italian scholar and poet Petrarch translates Greek and Roman scrolls, which are the springboard for humanism and the Italian Renaissance. 1353 The 100 stories told by 10 young Florentines fleeing from the plague in Boccaccio's The Decameron set a standard for Renaissance literature, and influence authors from Chaucer to Shakespeare. 1460 Plowman of Bohemia, a dialogue between death and a plowman, by Johannes von Teppel, is one of Germany's earliest humanist poems. 1522, 35 Dutch humanist Erasmus publishes his own Greek and Latin translations of the New Testament. They are the basis for Martin Luther's German and William Tyndale's English translations. In the 5-volume histories of Gargantua and Pantagruel, François Rabelais builds a fantasy world around two giants and their companions. The text includes all the elements of medieval folk humor that would have been familiar to contemporary readers: bodily functions, gross sexual behavior, birth, and death. Rich in satire, the tales are also fueled by the energy of Renaissance humanism, which spread into Northern Europe from Italy. Humanism at this time had a different meaning from the modern-day term, being concerned with a resurgence of interest in the wisdom of the classical world. Until this point, education had involved blindly following the Church's narrow scholastic tradition. The major humanist impetus was to build a complete program of education that included philosophy, grammar, poetry, history, and ancient Greek and Latin. Time, which diminishes and erodes all things, increases and augments generous deeds. Gargantua and Pantagruel. Scholarly and satirical. Poised at the threshold of this rapidly changing world, Rabelais finds ways to weave a humanist agenda into his giant adventures, but he first engages his readers' attention with scatological humor and absurd fantasy. At the very beginning, the text presents a midwife's eye view of the mother in labor, as the baby Gargantua struggles up through her body to be born out of her left ear. The exploits, battles, and quests of Gargantua and his son Pantagruel rattle on, liberally embellished with descriptions of meat feasts and shovel-loads of mustard tossed into cavernous mouths, pilgrims consumed in a salad, massive codpieces, armies washed away by urination, and cannonballs that fall out of Gargantua's hair after battle. Yet despite such crude and extreme behavior, Rabelais ensures that his giant creations will pass easily in the new world of Renaissance humanism by making them fully conversant in the finer points of learning, including medicine, law, and science. In a letter to his son, the old giant Gargantua contrasts his own upbringing in dark times with the current age, where light and dignity have been restored. After the arrival of the printing press in the mid-15th century, ordinary people could read the Bible in translation. For the first time they had direct access to the Word of God, unmediated by the agenda of the Church. Although he was a priest, Rabelais seized his chance to satirize religious dogmatism. Gargantua's mighty warrior, Friar John, is given the sumptuous abbey of Theleme filled with finely dressed nuns and monks who consort freely. Do what thou wilt is the rule of the order, as we all engage in things forbidden, and yearn for things denied. Witty, irreverent, and stuffed with intellectual marrow, no other novel is quite like Gargantua and Pantagruel. It has been celebrated by authors across the centuries, and most recently by postmodern writers, who have found much to admire in the narrative freedom of Rabelais' great work. Although Rabelais wrote Pantagruel first, the series is usually published in the order of the story, starting with Gargantua. The first two books are characterized by satire and bawdy humor, the third is more serious, and the fourth and fifth are darkly mocking. François Rabelais. Writer, medic, scholar of Greek, and priest, François Rabelais was an intellectual giant of 16th-century France. Born in the Touraine region probably around 1494, he studied law before taking holy orders with the Franciscans. He then transferred to a Benedictine order, where he studied medicine and Greek. In 1530, breaking his vows, he left the Benedictines to study medicine at Montpellier University. After graduating, he lectured on the works of ancient Greek physicians such as Hippocrates and Galen, whose work he translated, and worked as a physician in Lyon. Using the pseudonym Alcofribas Nasir, in 1532 Rabelais published Pantagruel, the first of the 5 books that would make up Gargantua and Pantagruel, although Rabelais' authorship of the 5th book is doubtful. All 5 books were condemned by the Sorbonne and the Church, and despite being protected by powerful patrons, Rabelais was forced to live abroad from 1545 to 1547, fearing persecution. He later received a papal pardon. He died in Paris in 1553. See also, the Decameron, the Canterbury Tales, Don Quixote, Tristram Shandy. In context. Focus the Pleiad. Before 1549 Joachim du Bellay sets out the principles of the Pleiad, promoting the imitation of classical models and the revival of archaic and dialect words, as well as the invention of new words. After 1555, taking inspiration from the Greek poet Callimachus, Ronsard's hymns eloquently celebrate natural phenomena, such as the sky, as well as gods and heroes. 1576 Jean-Antoine de Baif, the most learned poet of the Pleiad and a skilled poetic experimenter, publishes a highly original work, Mimes, Lessons, and Proverbs. 1578 Ronsard's sonnets for Hélène are full of references to the suffering of lovers, as well as to classical myth and fate. Pierre Ronsard was the leading light of a group of French humanist poets named for the bright Pleiades star cluster and also for a group of Alexandrian poets from the 3rd century BCE. The Pleiad aimed to create a French literature equal to that of Renaissance Italy. They imitated the genres and forms of the ancients, and spent much time refining and defending their controversial poetic beliefs. A sublime art. Ronsard saw poetry as a sublime art, rather than merely a courtly pastime. He was versatile and innovative, and his poems were melodious, sensual, and pagan, despite the fact that he was a cleric in minor orders. He made important contributions to the ode, the sonnet, and the elegy, and in 1558 became the official poet in the court of Charles IX, the King of France. He is best remembered today for his skillful, tender love poetry. In the poetry collection Les Amours de Cassandra, Ronsard set out to rival the Italian poet Petrarch. His devotion to Cassandra is described with imagery of piercing arrows, love potions, and poisons, which Petrarch had also deployed. But in Ronsard's hands this imagery is imbued with sensuality. He often refers to a desire to be transformed, for example, into golden droplets, so that he may fall into his beloved's lap, and then into a bowl so that he can carry her away on his back. I'd like to turn the deepest of yellows, falling, drop by drop, in a golden shower, into her lap. Les Amours de Cassandra. See also, Gargantua and Pantagruel. Miscellaneous poems. Les Fleurs du Mal. A Season in Hell. In context. Focus. Jacobean theater before 1592. Elements of Thomas Kyd's Elizabethan period. The Spanish tragedy, such as its theme of revenge and the play within a play, are continued in subsequent Jacobean dramas. 1598-1600. William Shakespeare's Henry IV Parts 1 and 2 reflect ongoing Jacobean interests in raucous comedy, history, violence, and honor. After 1610. The first performance of The Alchemist by Ben Jonson indulges the Jacobean thirst for harsh satire. 1614. John Webster's five-act revenge tragedy The Duchess of Malfi is truly Jacobean in its consideration of incest, torture, and madness. The drama produced in England during the reigns of Elizabeth I and James I. The Elizabethan and Jacobean eras, respectively, often depicted a murky world of murder, politics, and revenge, coupled with humor and pastiche. The term Jacobean is used to denote the continuity of English literature between these two periods. The Elizabethan era saw the rise of comedies and tragedies, then took on elements of psychology and the supernatural under James, whose court was a place of loose sexual morals. A Pact with the Devil. Born in 1564, in the Elizabethan age, Christopher Kit Marlowe lived wildly and died aged 29, reportedly stabbed in a brawl. His work is a harbinger of Jacobean drama's interest in darker themes. Based on a German story of a legendary alchemist, Marlowe's Dr. Faustus recounts the tale of an academic, highly respected as an intellect but nevertheless weary of the limits of conventional science. His thirst for knowledge is so great that he turns to magic and summons the devil Mephistopheles, who makes Faustus false promises about omnipotence and pleasure. The two make a deadly pact. Faustus agrees to give up his soul to the devil in exchange for the devil's service for 24 years. A good man driven by pride and corrupted by power, Faustus realizes too late that he has brought great evil upon himself. The reward of sin is death. That's hard. Dr. Faustus. See also, First Folio. The Fairy Queen. In context. Focus. Spain's golden century before 1499. The story of a procuress told in a series of dialogues, La Celestina, by Fernando de Rojas, marks the beginning of a literary renaissance in Spain. 1554. The anonymously published novella The Life of Lazarillo de Tormes and of his fortunes and adversities invents a new form, the picaresque novel. After 1609. Lope de Vega, Spain's most prolific playwright and a major poet, publishes his artistic manifesto New Rules for Writing Plays at this time to justify his writing style. 1635. Pedro Calderón de la Barca's philosophical allegory Life is a Dream is one of the golden century's most widely translated works. Straddling the 16th and 17th centuries, Spain's Golden Century refers to an extraordinary flourishing of the arts that began with the nation's rise to superpower status via the wealth of its colonies in America. Under the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, there was a free flow of ideas across Europe, with Spain's writers responding to the excitement of the Renaissance. New techniques in storytelling, verse, and drama produced defining prose, poetry, and plays. The anonymously authored Lazarillo de Tormes featured a picaro narrator of mixed fortunes, giving the world a new literary genre, the picaresque novel. Experimentation with verse forms as well as meter characterized the work of poet Garcilaso de la Vega. And the dramatist Lope de Vega produced a vast and dazzling oeuvre of 1,800 plays, rich in character, plot, and history, together with sonnets, novellas, and lyric poetry. In the same period, Miguel de Cervantes produced Don Quixote, the defining literary achievement of the Golden Century. Like Lope de Vega, he was writing near the end of an era, as Spain began to decline owing to a combination of despotic rule, religious fanaticism, and dwindling fortunes after the English defeat of the Armada. Out of this climate of flux leapt Don Quixote, an eccentric hero who bestrides a romantic past and an unstable present in a chivalric adventure that continues to enchant and inspire. Engagement with reality. Just as the plays of Cervantes' contemporary William Shakespeare are at the origin of modern drama, so Don Quixote is at the origin of modern fiction. Both writers delved into the motivations, actions, and emotions of their protagonists in a way that had not been attempted before, lending such characters as Hamlet, Macbeth, and Don Quixote a psychological complexity that made them seem real. Don Quixote engages with reality on two main levels. The main character of Cervantes' novel is enthralled by the knightly heroes of earlier chivalric romances, and renames himself Don Quixote in imitation of them. Yet unlike these romantic heroes, the characters of Don Quixote worry about everyday concerns, such as food and sleep. They travel through a world of taverns and windmills, along fairly nondescript roads and paths. The characters occupy an ordinary setting that resembles our world. On another level of engagement, the novel also operates according to the literary approach known as realism. Everything happens within the unities of time and place, without magical or mythical intervention. Giants of the imagination. Despite this realism, illusion has its place in the novel, but only in the mind of its central character. Don Quixote's encounters with innkeepers, prostitutes, goatherds, soldiers, priests, escaped convicts, and scorned lovers are magnified by his imagination into the kind of chivalrous quests that might be undertaken by the knight Amadis of Gaul, in the romances that bear his name. Donning his rusty armor, mounting the ancient horse he renames Rocinante, and enlisting the simple laborer Sancho Panza as his squire, Don Quixote, in the best tradition of chivalric romances, announces his love for the peasant girl he calls Dulcinea. In his realm of fantasy, the everyday is transformed into the extraordinary, the lasting symbol of which are the windmills of La Mancha, elevated by his imagination into fearsome enemies, with whom he sees fit to engage in combat. Further complexity. The gap between reality and illusion is the source of the book's comedy, and is a theme that has nourished fiction across the world in the subsequent 4 centuries. Yet, having established his theme, Cervantes deepens and complicates it in the second part of his novel, which was published 10 years after the first part. In Cervantes' Part 2, the characters, including Don Quixote himself, have read, or at least heard of, the first part of the novel in which they appear. When strangers encounter Don Quixote and Sancho Panza in person, they already know their famous history. A duke and duchess, for example, are excited when they meet Don Quixote, having read all about his adventures. They think it amusing to deceive him for entertainment, setting in play a string of imagined adventures, which result in a series of sadistic practical jokes. Honor, Cervantes suggests, clearly has nothing to do with social position. Readers begin to laugh less. While Cervantes was writing Part 2, a spurious second volume of the ingenious gentleman Don Quixote of La Mancha by the Licenciado Alonso Fernández de Avellaneda of Tordesillas appeared. Cervantes' literary creation had been stolen, inciting his comment, at the end of Part 2, "For me alone was Don Quixote born, and I for him, it was his to act, mine to write." In literary revenge, Cervantes sends his knight and squire off to Barcelona, to kidnap a character from the Avellaneda book. Finally, from so little sleeping and so much reading, his brain dried up and he went completely out of his mind. Don Quixote. In the second part of Don Quixote, Cervantes himself appears as a character, and other versions of Quixote are introduced. Reality is reflected by these various mirrors, deliberately confusing life and literature. Stories within stories. Literature is itself also a theme in the novel. We are told that Don Quixote's delusions result from reading too much, an interesting proposition to present to a reader of Don Quixote. But even when Don Quixote's books are burned by the priest, housekeeper, and barber, his improbable quest for glory continues. The role of the book's narrator is also questioned. Far from disappearing behind his characters and story, Cervantes makes frequent appearances, ostensibly in his own voice or often in the guise of a narrator called Cide Hamid Benengeli, a Moorish storyteller. The first words of the novel, "in some village in La Mancha, whose name I do not care to recall," exhibit the narrator's willfulness as well as the author's control over his material. The novel is written in episodic form, laying the groundwork for the many road novels and films that would follow. Most of the characters whom Don Quixote and Sancho Panza encounter have a story to tell, providing the novel with a format familiar to readers of Chaucer's The Canterbury Tales and Boccaccio's Decameron, and of the canon of tales from the East that entered southern Spain in the long centuries of Arab rule. For example, one of the novel's minor characters, Ricote, a Morisco, recounts his exile from Spain, a story within a story that introduces historical facts to the fictional narrative. The expulsion of the Moriscos in 1609 was highly topical, and whereas the earlier romances of chivalry had dwelt in a world of myth, Cervantes' novel was ready to engage with gritty, present-day issues. Illusion and disillusion. Stories proliferate at every turn, offering further opportunities for illusion and disillusion. Quixote and Sancho hear of a young man who became a shepherd after having studied pastoral literature, but died for the love of a beautiful shepherdess, Marcella. Accused of being the cause of his death, Marcella delivers a fiery speech at the funeral defending her right to live as she wants and refusing to be the object of male fantasy. Literature is seemingly condemned for its capacity to encourage its readers to live in a dream world, while the book achieves precisely this aim. Cervantes makes clear that as an author he will do exactly what he wants. Slowly, Don Quixote is brought back home, exhausted and disenchanted. "I was mad, now I am in my senses," he says, shortly before his death. By killing him off, Cervantes clearly wished to prevent any more unauthorized sequels. Despite Cervantes' claims of ownership, Don Quixote illustrates the way great fictional characters ultimately escape their authors, seeming to move away from the pages in which they first appear. He inspired English comic novelists such as Henry Fielding and French realists such as Gustave Flaubert, whose character Emma Bovary can be seen as a 19th-century Quixote in her bid to escape the tedium of life by imitating fiction. In the 20th century, Cervantes' playful and metafictional side inspired Jorge Luis Borges to write Pierre Menard, author of the Quixote, which Borges described, mischievously, as more subtle than Cervantes. Don Quixote is also immortalized as an English adjective for erratic if idealistic behavior, quixotic. "Tell me, Señor Don Alvaro," said Don Quixote, "am I at all like that Don Quixote you talk of?" Don Quixote. Interpretations. Standing at the junction between medieval chivalric tales and the modern novel, Don Quixote bequeathed a rich cultural legacy to generations of readers, and the work has been subject to shifting interpretations over the centuries. On publication in Spain's Golden Century, it was widely perceived as a satire, with Don Quixote as the butt of the jokes, but with much of Spain's history woven into the tale, it was also seen as a critique of the country's imperial ambitions. Don Quixote's delusions of heroism can be read as a symbol of his nation's wasteful expansionism in the face of decline. For revolutionaries, Don Quixote was an inspiration, a man who was right when the system was wrong, and the Romantics transformed him into a tragic character, a man with noble intentions, defeated by the second rate. This re-evaluation of the work over time points to the enduring power of its story and its writing, and guarantees the text a central place in literary history. La Mancha in central Spain is a dry but agriculturally important area, lacking in literary resonance and therefore an unlikely home for a would-be chivalric hero. Miguel de Cervantes. Miguel de Cervantes was born near Madrid, Spain, in 1547. His mother was the daughter of a nobleman, his father was a medical practitioner. Little is known of Cervantes' early life, but it is likely that he lived and worked in Rome around 1569, before enlisting in the Spanish Navy. Badly wounded in the Battle of Lepanto, he was captured by the Turks in 1575 and spent 5 years in prison in Algiers. His ransom was paid by a Catholic religious order, and he returned to Madrid. Cervantes' first major work, La Galatea, was published in 1585. He struggled financially but kept writing, finding success with Don Quixote. He died in 1616, in Madrid, but his coffin was later lost. In 2015, scientists claimed to have unearthed his remains in a convent in Madrid. Other key works: 1,613 exemplary novels. 1617 Persiles and Sigismunda. See also, the Canterbury Tales First Folio, the Decameron Amadis of Gaul, the Tin Drum Hopscotch, If on a Winter's Night a Traveller. In context. Focus the Bard. Before 1560, published in an English translation, the Geneva Bible is one of the major reference sources used by Shakespeare. 1565, the Roman poet Ovid's Metamorphoses, translated by Arthur Golding, is published and is a major literary source for Shakespeare. 1616 Works, by English writer Ben Jonson, is the first published collection of a popular dramatist's plays. After 1709, English writer Nicholas Rowe's edition of Shakespeare's complete works is published by Jacob Tunson. This is the first major attempt to re-edit Shakespeare's plays since the First Folio. Rowe modernized spelling and punctuation, and added scene divisions. When William Shakespeare died, his friend and rival playwright Ben Jonson wrote that his works would prove, not of an age, but for all time. The prediction proved true. Shakespeare's name is known across the globe, and he continues to be regarded as one of the most iconic writers of all time. His works have been translated into more than 80 languages, his dramas have been transformed into movies, animations, and musicals, and his words have inspired politicians, artists, and advertisers around the world. William Shakespeare. William Shakespeare was born in Stratford-upon-Avon in April 1564. Aged 18, he married Anne Hathaway, already pregnant with the first of their 3 children. Records reveal that Shakespeare was in London in the early 1590s, working as an actor. The first reference to him as a playwright in 1592 is somewhat unflattering. Fellow dramatist Robert Greene labeled him an upstart crow, beautified in our feathers. Shakespeare's history plays about King Henry VI had proved very popular by the late 1590s, and his reputation was such that in 1598 Francis Mears described the mellifluous and honey-tongued Shakespeare. The preeminent writer for the King's Men acting troupe and a shareholder in the Globe Theatre on Bankside, he was able to buy a house in Stratford-upon-Avon, to which he returned in his later years. He died on St. George's Day, April 23, 1616. Other key works: 1593 Venus and Adonis, 1594 The Rape of Lucrece, 1609 Shakespeare's Sonnets. Enduring appeal. In 1999 Shakespeare was voted Man of the Millennium in the UK, and speeches from The Tempest were used in the opening ceremony for the 2012 Olympic Games. He is one of the UK's greatest cultural exports, and each year around 800,000 visitors make the trip to Stratford-upon-Avon to visit the houses where his life story began. Why should Shakespeare, a man who died in 1616, continue to be so relevant for readers and theatregoers today? Much of his appeal lies in his ability to capture in words what it feels like to be human. His mastery of language allowed him to convey complex emotions with great impact and economy. The fact that Shakespeare's audiences represented a cross-section of society, from cobblers to courtiers, encouraged the playwright to develop a poetic voice that spoke across social rank, education, and age. His plays had to appeal to those who had paid one penny to stand in the yard, while also on occasion satisfying the tastes of the monarch and the court. It is little wonder then that the works of Shakespeare remain accessible to a broad audience. Shakespeare's imaginative tales have the capacity to delight schoolchildren as well as veteran playgoers. Some are born great, some achieve greatness, and some have greatness thrust upon them. Twelfth Night. Shakespeare was born in the market town of Stratford-upon-Avon. He lived in this house on Henley Street into adulthood, including the first 5 years of marriage to Anne Hathaway. A writer for all worlds. Shakespeare's genius lies in his talent for holding a mirror up to nature and reflecting his audience in it. People recognize themselves and others in his works. His most effective technique for engaging his audience was through use of soliloquy. It is in these moments when a character is left alone on stage, and begins to reveal the core of their being, that a strong connection is built between the world of the play and that of the onlookers. Soliloquy allows characters to share their innermost fears, disappointments, dreams, and ambitions. In moments of privacy, Shakespeare's characters can appear fragile and vulnerable. They can also be revealed to be duplicitous and villainous. By allowing them to speak in private to the audience, Shakespeare created the illusion that the spectators were privy to every thought. His characters moved beyond being mere vehicles for plot development, and appeared to be individuals living in the moment, making decisions from scene to scene. Shakespeare's plays were designed to be enjoyed in the theater, but readers could also experience some of them in print after they had appeared on stage. Hamlet, Romeo and Juliet, A Midsummer Night's Dream, and Henry V were printed as individual works during Shakespeare's lifetime. However, other plays such as Julius Caesar, Macbeth, As You Like It, and Twelfth Night do not seem to have been printed before the dramatist died, and would have disappeared completely had it not been for the publication. In 1623 of Mr. William Shakespeare's comedies, histories, and tragedies, otherwise known as the First Folio. All the world's a stage, and all the men and women merely players. As You Like It. The First Folio. There are only some 240 copies of the First Folio still in existence, and it has become one of the world's most valuable books, with a price of around $6 million at auction. Were it not for this book, many of Shakespeare's masterpieces would have been lost forever. In the Elizabethan and Jacobean periods there was no guarantee that a play would be published simply because it had been performed. Publishers tended to think that dramas had a fashionable, rather than enduring, appeal, and they preferred to put their energies into publishing Bibles, sermons, and chronicles of English history. Ben Jonson was the first dramatist to have his works collected together and published as a whole. His works appeared in 1616, the year of Shakespeare's death, and its popularity inspired others to consider similar volumes. Two of Shakespeare's fellow actors and close friends, John Hemmings and Henry Condell, oversaw the mammoth task that went into producing the First Folio. This would have been a difficult job, and their first priority was to locate the play texts. The playwright's original manuscript was either used, or transcribed, by the company, and then served as the text from which cue scripts were created. Each actor would have their own lines transcribed with just a line or more to listen out for as their cue. Over time, manuscripts disappear, or are altered, revised, and covered in ink. Today there are no Shakespearean manuscripts in existence, although there are 147 lines in a play called Sir Thomas More that are thought to be in Shakespeare's own hand. The first folio serves as a monument then to Shakespeare's memory. It proved so popular that it had to be reprinted just 9 years later, and it has continued to be republished in differing formats ever since. It is little wonder that the first folio is regarded as such an important book today, given the vision and determination that went into ensuring its publication. A threefold division. The first folio divides the plays of Shakespeare into comedies, histories, and tragedies. The division into 3 genres is somewhat arbitrary, and is more reflective of the publisher's desire than it is suggestive of the way in which Shakespeare viewed his plays. Julius Caesar, for example, is listed as a tragedy when it could just as readily be a history play. Similarly, Richard III is listed under the histories when it could also be under the tragedies. Shakespeare did not necessarily think in terms of writing for one particular genre. As an innovative writer, he would frequently blend characteristics associated with different genres to create variety in his own work. At moments of great sorrow, for example, he occasionally injects an element of black humor, which serves to alter the pervading mood. The gravedigger sings as he digs a grave in Hamlet, the porter jokes with the audience as Macbeth and his wife leave the stage to wash their hands of blood. And Cleopatra is moved to mirth as she contemplates her own suicide in Antony and Cleopatra. Similarly, Shakespeare's comedies, which one might expect to be light and frivolous in tone, can sometimes prove dark and dangerous. Isabella is sexually harassed by Angelo in Measure for Measure. Oberon enchants Titania's eyes with a potion that will lead her to fall in love with the first thing she sees in A Midsummer Night's Dream. And Malvolio's puritanical streak in Twelfth Night leads to a very public humiliation. The Egyptian queen Cleopatra, here played by Harriet Walter, clasps the worm and succumbs to its bite, like a lover's pinch, during the passionate, deadly climax to Antony and Cleopatra. The Globe Theatre, co-owned by Shakespeare, opened in 1599 on the south bank of the Thames, but by 1644 it had been demolished. A recreated Globe opened at the site in the 1990s. Relationships tested. While Shakespeare's comedies share many similarities, they also differ markedly from one another. They almost all end with the prospect of marriage, which helps to unite individuals and communities simultaneously. It also brings a celebratory, festive quality to the play's close and distances the memory of any misunderstandings that have thwarted the merriment beforehand. Love's Labour's Lost is unusual among the comedies, because the play ends not with a marriage, but an agreement between the couples to meet again after a year spent apart. While the comedies ordinarily end in harmony and reunion, the tragedies are altogether more destructive in their dramatic trajectory. Relationships are tested, put under stress, and eventually broken, often resulting in a tableau of death to close the play. The same trajectory can be followed in some of the history plays as well. Tales of kingship, government, and rule are often driven by conflict, feud, and rivalry. Despite the differences, Shakespeare's plays are connected through the dramatist's desire to give voice to a socially diverse cast of characters. Pimps, bawds, and prostitutes rub shoulders with the future King of England in Henry IV Part 1 and Part 2. Bottom the Weaver encounters the fairy world in A Midsummer Night's Dream. And the monarch listens to the thoughts of a fool and a beggar in King Lear. Our revels now are ended. These our actors are melted into air. The Tempest. The Torment of the Tragic. Of the plays included in the first folio, there are certain works that have acquired the status of Shakespearean masterpieces. People do not always need to have read or seen Hamlet in performance to be familiar with the words, to be, or not to be, that is the question. Hamlet's association with melancholy and deep thought is now famous the world over. In him, Shakespeare created one of the most poetic voices of all time, and the literary illusion of a troubled conscience. Shakespeare walks listeners through the twists and turns of Hamlet's imagined mind as he struggles with issues of morality and mortality. Hamlet is troubled with the idea of what dreams may come when we have shuffled off this mortal coil. As countless poems, novels, and dramas suggest, Hamlet is not alone. King Lear is another of the tragic creations that speaks directly to Shakespeare's understanding of the human condition. In old age, Lear's understanding of himself and the world around him is at odds with the views of a younger generation. His pride leads him to make rash judgments, which serve to ostracize him from friends and family, leaving him to reflect upon his actions and his relationships with other people. Lear, like so many of Shakespeare's other tragic figures, is tormented by his own thoughts, and it takes the duration of a play for him to reassess his situation and see better. Prince Hamlet of Denmark, here portrayed by Laurence Olivier in the 1948 film version he also directed, is a psychologically complex character who feigns madness to exact revenge. Questions of identity. A Midsummer Night's Dream is one of Shakespeare's most popular comedies, and Bottom one of his most memorable creations. When rehearsing in the woods, Bottom's head is magically transformed into that of an ass by the knavish sprite Puck. Visual effects have a much stronger impact on the stage than on the page. The hilarity of seeing an actor alter their whole being to convey this metamorphosis can only really ever be fully appreciated in performance, but readers will appreciate that Bottom's experience of life has been overturned, and for a brief moment he gets to feel life as someone other than himself. This technique is repeated in some of Shakespeare's other comedies where disguise allows characters to alter their identity. Rosalind in As You Like It and Viola in Twelfth Night both cross-dress as young men, and in the Comedy of Errors two sets of twins are mistaken for one another to great comic effect. The enchanted Bottom the Weaver, of A Midsummer Night's Dream, whose head has been replaced with that of an ass, becomes desirable to Titania, who is under the spell of a love potion. Perils of Power. Shakespeare's history plays are filled with duplicitous characters. In Richard III, Richard of Gloucester disguises his intentions to murder his way to the throne and becomes arguably Shakespeare's greatest villain. Set apart by his misshapen body, the hunchback Richard is forcefully charismatic from his first soliloquy, which opens the play. He informs the audience that he is determined to prove a villain, and proclaims that he is subtle, false, and treacherous. The soliloquies, as well as the symbolism of his deformity, cast Richard as the vice figure of the drama. Audiences love to hate him. And yet, as is the case in all of Shakespeare's history plays from Richard II to Henry VI, power is shown to be fragile. Shakespeare notes in Henry IV Part 2, "Uneasy lies the head that wears a crown, those in power are never free from danger." This is a lesson that Richard III learns to his surprise. Having murdered his way to the throne, he has to continue killing until he feels that all threats to his crown have been wiped out. Works for the ages. The first folio stretches to over 900 pages, contains 36 plays, and features the best-known portrait of Shakespeare on its title page, but it does not include Pericles or the two noble kinsmen, which can be found in most copies of Shakespeare's complete works today. The Tempest, Cymbeline, and The Winter's Tale are often referred to as romances in modern editions, while Coriolanus, Julius Caesar, and Antony and Cleopatra are sometimes spoken of today as his Roman plays. Shakespeare's works have burst beyond the generic confines in which they were first published, but it is thanks to the first folio that Shakespeare's works have survived at all. The authorship debate. Various conspiracy theories have circulated since the late 18th century claiming that William Shakespeare of Stratford-upon-Avon was not the author behind the works published in the first folio. There is a long catalogue of alternative candidates, and it continues to grow. The list includes figures such as Sir Francis Bacon, Christopher Marlowe, Edward de Vere, and even Queen Elizabeth I, all of whom died a decade before Shakespeare's last plays were staged or published. How could the Elizabethan playwright Christopher Marlowe have written the plays when he was murdered in 1593? One story goes that Christopher Marlowe did not really die in a tavern brawl in 1593, but went into hiding and continued to supply the public theatres with plays under the pseudonym William Shakespeare. The arguments for the other contenders are equally improbable. See also, Oedipus the King Metamorphoses, The Canterbury Tales, Dr. Faustus Moby Dick, Ulysses. In context. Focus. French neoclassicism before 1637. Pierre Corneille's tragicomedy, Le Cid, is performed in Paris to popular acclaim, but criticized by the Académie Française for not observing the classical unities. 1653. Earliest performance of The Rivals, the first of Philippe Quinault's prolific output of comedies, tragicomedies, and lesser-known tragedies. After 1668. Jean de La Fontaine adapts his collection of fables from classical sources, including Aesop and Phaedrus, stretching the metrical verse of the time. 1671. Molière, Corneille, and Quinault collaborate on Psyche, a tragicomic ballet. 1677. Phaedra continues Jean Racine's series of tragedies on Greek mythological themes. A fascination with all things classical overtook Europe during the Enlightenment period. The ancient Greek ideals of form, clarity, and elegance inspired a neoclassical movement in all the arts, with France leading the way in the field of literature. The classical influence was most apparent in French drama, which during the 17th century adopted a reinterpretation of the conventions of Greek theatre, as described in Aristotle's Poetics. This stylized drama in verse frequently took the form of tragedies, which often reflected Greek mythological themes, but there was a growing public demand for comedy, which was met by the witty plays of Molière. A comedy of manners. Molière's major contribution was the Comedy of Manners, satirizing the mores of the time with larger-than-life characters such as Alceste, the protagonist of The Misanthrope, whose cantankerous rejection of politesse is challenged when he falls for a society girl, Célimène. Fooled by her flirting, he begins to act in exactly the manner he despises in others, but reverts to his usual character when criticizing the sentimental poem of a nobleman. This gets him into legal trouble, and loses him friends, so he seeks solace with the flighty Célimène. While poking fun at Alceste's misanthropy, Molière also exposes the hypocrisy of 17th-century courtly manners, in the spirit of the comedies of the Greek dramatist Aristophanes. The success of Molière's comedies, including The School for Wives, Tartuffe, and The Miser, marked the beginning of an era of elegant, witty theatre that continued through the 18th century. The genre caught on in England, inspiring a line of work that can be traced from Restoration comedy, through Oliver Goldsmith and Richard Brinsley Sheridan, and novelists such as Jane Austen, to Oscar Wilde. See also, Oedipus the King, Candide, Le Cid, Phaedra, Pride and Prejudice, The Picture of Dorian Gray. In context. Focus. The metaphysical poets before 1627. John Donne deploys metaphysical exaggeration in his melancholic love elegy, A Nocturnal upon St. Lucy's Day, Oft a flood have we too wept, and so drowned the whole world, us too. 1633. The Agony, by George Herbert, applies metaphysical wit to matters of belief. Love is that liquor sweet and most divine, which my God feels as blood, but I, as wine. 1648. Robert Herrick's book Hesperides includes the famous Carpe Diem poem, To the Virgins, to make much of time, with its famous line, Gather ye rosebuds while ye may. 1650. Henry Vaughan, inspired by George Herbert, publishes The World, a poem of mystical devotion. The term metaphysical poets was coined by the essayist and literary critic Samuel Johnson to describe a group of 17th-century English writers that included John Donne, George Herbert, and Andrew Marvell. Their style was marked by wit, sophisticated logic, and occult metaphor, and often focused on themes of love, sexuality, and faith. Sensual pleasures. Better known as a politician than a poet during his lifetime, Marvell produced a body of work, published posthumously as Miscellaneous Poems, that contains the famous love poem to his coy mistress. In the poem, the speaker tries to persuade the object of his desire to seize the day and sleep with him. His argument to break down her resistance contains typically metaphysical conceits, fanciful ideas pursued to an imaginative conclusion. The grave's a fine and private place, but none I think do their embrace. History, theology, and astronomy are all brought into play by Marvell, who challenges the puritanical Christianity of the 17th century as a barrier to sensual pleasures. He also brings vivid imagery and intellectual vitality to the pastoral, in poems such as The Mower to the Glow-Worms and The Garden, where he achieves a beautiful balance between abstraction and the senses, as he eulogizes the pleasure of withdrawing to a green thought in a green shade. Stumbling on melons, as I pass, ensnared with flowers, I fall on grass. The Garden. See also, Metamorphoses les Amours de Cassandra Paradise Lost the Waste Land. In context. Focus. Haiku and haibun before. 1686 Matsuo Basho composes one of his most famous haiku, about a frog plopping with a splash into an ancient pond. It inspires a competition on the same theme among other haiku writers in Edo. After 1744 the great haiku poet Yosa Buzan publishes his travel notes after following in the footsteps of Basho. 1819 Kobayashi Isa proves a worthy successor to Basho with The Spring of My Life, combining prose and haiku in a haibun. Isa was prolific, writing around 20,000 haiku, including 230 on the Firefly. 1885 Masaka Shika starts to write haiku on portraits he draws. He advocates writing from life, in the field, as an artist would paint a landscape. Matsuo Basho of Edo was the master of the haiku, a short Japanese verse form. Rendered in English in 3 or 4 lines, the haiku captures a fleeting moment, often with poignancy as well as sharp observation. But Basho's greatest work is in a composite genre, the haibun, in which haiku is embedded in a prose narrative. A Noble Journey. Basho's aim in The Narrow Road to the Interior was to record a spiritual pilgrimage to the far north of the country, undertaken in the spirit of Zen Buddhism and to honor poets who had traveled before him. On this journey, direct encounters with nature, enriched by cultural associations, and visits to Shinto shrines, confirm Basho's liberation from selfish attachments. The poetry and the prose are in perfect equilibrium, illuminating each other like a pair of mirrors facing inwards. Journeying mostly on foot, 400s of miles, Basho searches for wisdom, relating his discoveries in prose that is vivid and frequently tinged with elegiac melancholy, even a reference to pines shaped by salty winds, trained by them into bonsai, appears solemn and resigned. His haiku achieve the sought-after quality of kensho, or glimpse of enlightenment, a brief awakening into truth. Those who float away their lives on boats or who grow old leading horses are forever traveling, and their homes are wherever those travels take them. The Narrow Road to the Interior. See also, The Tale of Genji on the Road. In context. Focus. Kabuki and bunraku before. See point 1603 Kabuki drama, an unruly theatrical form that blends song, dance, action, and mime. Originates with a female dancer called Okuni, an attendant at the Shinto shrine of Izumo. See point 1680 bunraku develops as a form of musical puppet theater in which half-life-size puppets act out a chanted romantic narrative called jiruri. After 1748 Chushingura, or The Tale of the 47 Ronin, by Takedo Imuzo, Namiki Sosuke, and Miyoshi Shiraku, is performed. Composed as bunraku and adapted into a kabuki, it is the nearest rival to Chikamatsu's work for popularity. 1963 Osaka's Bunraku Association rescues the jiruri theatrical form from decline. Kabuki and bunraku are both forms of traditional Japanese theater that originated in the 17th century. Kabuki dealt with ribald material and was performed by wandering troupes of women who were often available as prostitutes. Bunraku is a form of puppet theater, in which each puppet has a lead puppeteer who moves the right hand, another the left, and a third the legs and feet. The three men remain in full view of the audience, although they are often dressed in black. There is usually a single chanter, who portrays different characters by changing his pitch. Japan's national bard. The greatest dramatist in either of these forms remains Chikamatsu Manzaemon. He was born into the samurai class but chose instead to write drama, and in time became Japan's most famous playwright. His work often features individuals caught in a conflict between ethical and personal demands. Produced as bunraku and adapted for kabuki, Chikamatsu's play The Love Suicides at Sonozaki is his masterpiece. It was written within 2 weeks of the real event it was based on, that of a young couple who took their lives in a forest. In his play, Chikamatsu created two characters who, like William Shakespeare's star-crossed couple Romeo and Juliet, have become synonymous with the theme of ill-fated lovers. Tokubiai is a young man whose family has received a dowry, but he refuses to marry the chosen bride because he loves Ohatsu, a prostitute. A rival for her favors threatens to frame him as a thief. Unable to do his duty to his family, Tokubiai can neither redeem his honor, nor have a future with Ohatsu, and so the two decide to make a death pact. The play and similar ones provoked a spate of copycat lovers' suicides, leading to a ban on the genre for a period after 1723. However, the play's language is considered to be some of the most beautiful in Japanese literature. See also, First Folio The Well Cradle The Temple of the Golden Pavilion. In context. Focus. Fictional autobiography after 1726 Gulliver's Travels, by Anglo-Irish author Jonathan Swift, is published as a traveler's tale and fictional autobiography and becomes an immediate success. 1740 English author Samuel Richardson publishes Pamela, a fictional autobiography that chronicles the life of its lead character, a maidservant, through a series of letters. 1749 The comic novel autobiography Tom Jones, by English writer Henry Fielding, is published and follows the adventures of a high-spirited foundling boy. 1849, 50 David Copperfield, by English author Charles Dickens, is published. Although a fictional work, the life of the main protagonist has close parallels to Dickens' own. Constructing the narrative of a literary text around a fictional autobiography is a device that not only enables a writer to tell the tale of the life of an individual as if that person were the author but also gives the impression that the words spoken are a direct transcription of actual events. Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe was the progenitor of this fictional autobiographical voice. A number of other notable 18th and 19th century characters followed Crusoe, including Jonathan Swift's Gulliver, Henry Fielding's Tom Jones, and Charles Dickens' David Copperfield. The title page of the first edition of Robinson Crusoe did not cite Defoe as the author. Instead, the words, written by himself, appeared beneath the title, and so readers may well have imagined the story to be true. The book's opening sentence, which begins, "I was born in the year 1632, suggests that this is a real tale recounted by the individual who experienced these adventures. The details of the author's birth lend authenticity to the work as an autobiographical text, and therefore also as a true narrative. Such verisimilitude is enhanced by the fact that parts of the novel take the form of a journal. Robinson Crusoe and Gulliver's Travels both use an autobiographical voice to present their tales of travel as factual accounts of real-life experiences. They nevertheless differ in several crucial respects. Island Castaways. Robinson Crusoe is widely credited as a foundational text of realism, and, for many, it also ranks as the first English novel. It is believed that Defoe's work was inspired by the account of a real-life castaway, Alexander Selkirk, who, in the early 18th century, was marooned on an island in the Pacific. An instant success on publication, Defoe's story mentions expeditions in exotic regions of Africa and Brazil, and a slaving mission that leads to shipwreck on a Caribbean island. Crusoe tells of his attempts to rescue provisions from the ship and of his solitary existence on the island. He builds a shelter and makes tools with which to hunt, farm, and forage. He keeps track of the days by cutting notches in a wooden cross. He reads the Bible and thanks God. He domesticates a parrot. For years this is his life. Then, in one of the most iconic moments in literature, Crusoe discovers a footprint in the sand, leading to an obsessive fear that he will be attacked by savages. After 2 years spent barricading himself in a fortress, he encounters a native from a nearby island who is fleeing from cannibals. Crusoe rescues him, puts him to work, and names him Friday, after the day on which they met. The relationship between the two has been critiqued as one of master and slave. Crusoe, as a bearer of civilization, is a symbol of burgeoning British imperialism. Just as European nations claim land for colonies, so Crusoe assumes dominion over the island, and sees himself as an owner and absolute lord. Crusoe's autobiographical island memoir proved remarkably resilient, inspiring endless reimaginings and giving rise to an entire subgenre, the Robinsonade. A pivotal text in English literature, it has had a significant influence, perhaps unrivaled by any other individual work, and its motifs have become part of the general culture. He kneeled down again, kissed the ground, and set my foot upon his head. This it seems was in token of swearing to be my slave forever. Robinson Crusoe. Daniel Defoe. Daniel Defoe is thought to have been born in London in 1660. In 1684 he married Mary Tuffley, then spent many years as a businessman and merchant, but went bankrupt in 1692. In 1697, he became a confidant of King William III and travelled Britain as a secret agent. In 1702, his pamphlet The Shortest Way with the Dissenters led to his imprisonment, due to its political content, and to a second bankruptcy. Released thanks to politician Robert Harley, Defoe acted as Harley's spy, traveling around Britain and reporting back on public opinion. Defoe did not turn to novel writing until his late 50s, and became a key figure in the construction of the form, finding great success with Robinson Crusoe. Defoe died in 1731. Other key works. 1722 Moll Flanders. 1722 A Journal of the Plague Year. 1724 Roxana. See also, Gulliver's Travels Tom Jones David Copperfield The Catcher in the Rye. In context. Focus the philosophes. Before. 1721 Persian Letters, by Montesquieu, satirizes French society through the eyes of two Persian visitors, who compare Christianity with Islam and undermine Catholic doctrine. 1751, 72 Ron D'Alembert and Denis Diderot produced the great collective enterprise of the Enlightenment, the Encyclopédie, to change the way people think. After 1779 Nathan the Wise, a play by Gotthold Ephraim Lessing set during the Third Crusade, offers an aspirational vision of religious tolerance. 1796 Diderot's philosophical novel Jacques the Fatalist, presenting a determinist worldview, has among its characters two men who cannot stop dueling. A diverse group of writers and intellectuals who lived in France in the 18th century came to be known as the philosophes. Their work nevertheless extended beyond philosophy into social, cultural, ethical, and political realms. The philosophes, who included Voltaire, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Denis Diderot, and Montesquieu, were part of the widespread intellectual shift in Europe that was known as the Enlightenment, the assault on superstition, intolerance, and injustice in the name of reason and intellectual freedom that lasted from the late 17th century to the French Revolution of 1789. Indeed, the revolution was inspired by the ideas of philosophers and scientists, together with the prevailing spirit of rationalism and political liberalism. Man was born to live either in the convulsions of misery, or in the lethargy of boredom. Candide. Supreme optimism. Candide is a conte philosophique, a philosophical fable in which Voltaire gave narrative expression to Enlightenment values. He turned his ferocious satirical scrutiny in particular on the ideas expressed by the German Gottfried Wilhelm von Leibniz in his philosophy of optimism, which held that because God is a benevolent deity, this world must be the best possible world. Leibniz's ideas are echoed in the novel by the philosopher Dr. Pangloss, who utters his mantra, "All is for the best in the best of all possible worlds, even in the face of repeated disaster." In a way that challenges this rosy metaphysics, the young hero, Candide, suffers a series of ordeals, including expulsion from a baronial home, numerous violent misadventures, and an eventual reunion with his lost love, Cunegonde, only to find that he no longer desires her. Yet the misfortunes come so thick and fast and are related in so matter-of-fact a tone that the overall effect is comic. Women are violated by men, armies destroy each other, people are robbed and enslaved. Reversals of all kinds make life, health, and happiness precarious. In a world of greed, lust, and brutality, good deeds are scarce. Measured against the heartlessness of reality, Panglossian optimism is patently naive. Gullible and naive, Candide is incapable of forming his own opinions on life, his vision of the world, his ideas on determinism, optimism, and free will, for example, is constructed by the views of the people around him. Personal influences. Although vibrant with melodramatic incident, Candide is a tale of ideas, albeit with autobiographical roots. Voltaire had known personal misfortune, including abuse by Jesuit teachers, loss of favor in the French court, and expulsion from Prussia. In addition, too, public catastrophes worked on his imagination and profoundly affected his views on God and free will, the earthquake that destroyed Lisbon, Portugal, in 1755, and the start of the 7 Years' War, which unleashed destruction in Europe. Both events feature in Candide in fictionalized form. Within the book, a narrative of intertwining personal stories becomes a thread that connects depictions of contrasting social systems. The first community we encounter is the feudal castle from which the hero gets expelled. There is a utopian interlude in El Dorado, an egalitarian nation of natural plenty. Finally, Candide, now living on a farm in Turkey, visits a family farm dedicated to cooperative work, where the people are happy. The ending, with Candide saying, "We must go and cultivate our garden," indicates that it is possible to be happy, by means of hard work, and an absence of philosophy. Voltaire. Son of a notary, François-Marie Hérouet was born in Paris, France, in 1694. A dramatist and poet, he adopted Voltaire as a nom de plume. His satirical verse earned him a spell in the Bastille prison, Paris, in 1717-18. After 2 years in England, his letters concerning the English nation was suppressed in his homeland. It was seen as a critique of the government. A study of Louis XIV restored him to favor at Versailles, where he became royal historiographer in 1745. Later, in Berlin, he became close friends with the Prussian king, Frederick the Great. He wrote his philosophical tales at his estate at Ferney, France, when in his 60s, including Candide. He also worked for agricultural reform as well as for greater justice for wronged individuals. He died in Paris in 1778, aged 84. Other key works: 1718 Oedipus, 1733 Philosophic Letters, 1747 Zadig, 1752 Micromegas. See also, Gulliver's Travels, Jacques the Fatalist. In context. Focus Sturm und Drang. Before 1750 Swiss-born philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau writes Discourse on the Arts and Sciences, an essay in which he condemns the Enlightenment drive towards pure rationalism. 1774 The Sorrows of Young Werther, a novel by German writer Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, is an immediate success and contains the elements that will characterize Sturm und Drang, such as high-flown expressions of intense emotion and the futile struggle of a young hero. 1777 Friedrich Maximilian von Klinger's play Sturm und Drang is first performed, giving the movement its name. After 1808 Goethe moves away from Sturm und Drang with his dramatic masterpiece Faust. The Sturm und Drang movement was a sudden and brief explosion of German literature that lasted around 10 years. Sturm und Drang consisted of plays and novels characterized by great energy, physical and emotional violence, fierce and anguished lyricism, and the breaking of taboos in order to express the essential drama of the human heart. The movement was a reaction to Enlightenment values of pure reason and rationalism. Some early Enlightenment thinkers felt that genius could be attained through hard work and practice, and that good literature must adhere to classical forms. But to the Stürmer und Dranger these ideas were stifling, and were discarded with abandon. Sturm und Drang plays ignored the established formal structures. They might not have 5 acts, or dialogue might not be written in perfectly formed sentences. And aside from being expressive, the language could be shocking, too. Both Friedrich Schiller's play The Robbers and Johann Wolfgang von Goethe's novel The Sorrows of Young Werther exist in several editions, because the original language had to be toned down. The Robbers. Youthful exuberance. Schiller's The Robbers, first performed in 1782, was the final flowering of a fading movement. The plot concerns 2 aristocratic brothers with opposing outlooks, Karl, an honorable idealist, and Franz, who is cold, materialistic and manipulative. Karl takes to the Bohemian woods to lead a band of robbers after Franz has turned their father against him and stolen his inheritance. The robbers broke taboos. The plot involved violence, robbery, and murder, and it is the hero, Karl, who leads the gang that commits the illegal and violent acts. In the depths of his passion he even kills his innocent cousin Amalia, to whom he is betrothed. The language of the play is as wild and stormy as the emotions it expresses, but it is also lyrical too, and The Robbers is regarded as one of the finest examples of dramatic writing in German literature. It is still considered a masterpiece today, and many critics also see in it the beginnings of European melodrama. The Sturm und Drang movement was made up of energetic young men. Most were in their 20s, the oldest only in their 30s. Perhaps as the authors grew older, they lost their taste for youthful rebellion, which might account for the movement's brevity. Many chose more reflective modes of expression thereafter, as the Sturm und Drang era settled into a long and fruitful period of Weimar classicism and German romanticism. Friedrich Schiller. Johann Christoph Friedrich von Schiller was born in Württemberg, Germany. A poet, playwright, philosopher, and historian, he wrote The Robbers while still at school. The play made him an overnight sensation, but it did not provide financial independence. Schiller later became a professor of history and philosophy in Jena, whose university is now named after him. His friendship with Goethe led, in the late 18th century, to their setting up the Weimar Theater, which would become the leading theater in Germany. Schiller was ill throughout his life, and he died of tuberculosis aged 45 in 1805, after making a fruitful return to playwriting in his last few years. He is still considered by many to be Germany's greatest classical playwright. Other key works: 1784 Intrigue and Love, 1786 Ode to Joy, 1787 Don Carlos, 1794 On the Aesthetic Education of Man, 1800 Wallenstein. See also, Candide, The Sorrows of Young Werther, Nachstück Faust, Jane Eyre, Wuthering Heights, The Brothers Karamazov. In context. Focus. The epistolary novel before 1669. One of the earliest epistolary novels is published, Letters of a Portuguese Nun. It is attributed to French author Gabriel Joseph de la Verne, Comte de Guilleraigs. 1740. The hugely popular novel Pamela, by English author Samuel Richardson, details the corruption of an innocent maidservant. 1747, 48 Richardson's tragic tale Clarissa is one of the longest novels in the English language and considered to be his masterpiece. 1761 Swiss-born philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau writes Julie, or The New Heloise, in which he uses the epistolary form to explore philosophical questions of rationality, morality, and autonomy. Letters, diaries, and notes were the primary written means by which people communicated with one another in both daily life and literature during the 18th century. Les Liaisons Dangereuses is an example of a literary style known as the epistolary novel, which tells a story in the form of letters and, sometimes, other documents. Although it largely died out after the 1800s, in its heyday the epistolary novel was a popular and fashionable genre, reflecting the social world of a great age of correspondence. Laclos did not simply imitate this genre, he radically extended it. The most famous epistolary novels of the period, such as Samuel Richardson's Clarissa and Jean-Jacques Rousseau's Julie, or The New Heloise, were often tedious in their meticulous and lengthy descriptions, and moralistic tone. Unlike his contemporaries, Laclos used the epistolary form to provide an exciting pace of action, and his characters often speak in the witty and urbane manner of the time. When one woman stabs another to the heart, she rarely misses the vital spot and the wound can never be healed. Les Liaisons Dangereuses. The ruin of innocence. In France, the epistolary novel was linked with narratives of passion and the calculated seduction of women. Key to the success of these novels was the philosophy of libertinage, in which eroticism, sexual depravity, and a lifestyle of excess and vice were intermingled with sophisticated wordplay. In Les Liaisons Dangereuses, letters between multiple characters exposed the moral decline of the French aristocracy just before the Revolution. Laclos' key actors in this form of seduction as sport are the libertine Vicomte de Valmont, and the Marquise de Mertert, with her public facade of a virtuous lady. Former lovers, they try to outdo each other in their cruelty and manipulative degradation of others through sexual exploitation. Their own and others' letters show how they plot the pursuit of their entertainment like a military campaign, the narrative tracing a calculated process of ruination involving rape, sexual corruption, and humiliation. Moral ambiguity. Unlike his contemporaries, who often addressed the reader directly in their epistolary novels, Laclos removed his authorial presence from the narrative, leaving his characters to speak for themselves. Because of his absent narrational voice and the lack of any authorial condemnation of his characters' actions, contemporary reviewers wondered if Laclos too was as wicked as Mertert and Valmont. The cleverness of Les Liaisons Dangereuses lies in its moral ambiguity and the extent to which Laclos implicates the reader in society's treatment of women as pawns in games of ownership and sexual domination. In her own words to Valmont, Mertert views her actions as part of a wider battle of the sexes in which she is born to avenge my sex and subjugate yours, although in doing this, she brings destruction as much to other women as to men. In the letters through which he presents this battle, Laclos seduces his reader via the pleasure to be found in a voyeuristic literary exploration of artful temptation. The letters that form Laclos' text are also objects in the plot, used to manipulate. Mertert and Valmont, the orchestrating villains, are adept at writing letters in ways that exploit how others will read meaning into them. Pierre Coderlos de Laclos. Pierre Coderlos de Laclos was born in 1741 in Amiens, to a family that had only recently become part of the French nobility. The family's relative unimportance in the social hierarchy meant that as a young man Laclos looked to the military for a viable career. While captain of an artillery regiment at Besançon in 1778, he began writing his only novel, influenced by the work of Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Although Les Liaisons Dangereuses was scandalous because of its libertine characters and themes of sexual vice, Laclos himself was not a faithless seducer. He married his lover, Marie Solange Dupère, when she fell pregnant. They went on to have 2 children and live a happy life. He escaped the guillotine in 1794 and devoted himself to his family until his death in 1803 from fever. Other key works. 1777 Ernestine. 1783 Des Femmes et de leur Éducation. 1790, 91 Journal de Amos de la Constitution. See also, Robinson Crusoe, Clarissa, The Sorrows of Young Werther, Dracula, The Moonstone. Further reading. The Decameron. Giovanni Boccaccio. Structured as a frame narrative, The Decameron by Italian writer, poet, and scholar Giovanni Boccaccio is a collection of 100 tales. The frame story uniting them is that of 10 young adults, 7 women and 3 men, who flee plague-ridden Florence to an attractive villa in nearby Fiesole. The group decides that every day, each of them should tell a story, resulting in 100 stories over 10 days. Whoever is nominated leader for the day chooses the subject and stipulates rules for the stories to be told. Each day ends with one person singing a canzone or song, while the others dance. The result is a dazzling collection of exquisitely written tales, ranging from stories of tragic love and bawdiness through to the power of human will and tricks that women play on men, that inspired writers of the Renaissance and beyond. A kissed mouth does not lose its freshness, for like the moon it always renews itself. The Decameron, Giovanni Boccaccio. Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. Consisting of some 2,500 lines, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight is one of the best-known examples of Middle English alliterative verse. Of unknown authorship, the poem is a chivalric romance set in the early days of the legendary King Arthur's court. A beautifully written tale of enchantment that is full of psychological insight, the poem describes a series of challenges and temptations faced by the hero, Sir Gawain, following an encounter with the mysterious Green Knight. The Well Cradle. Zimi Motokiyo. The Well Cradle is a classical no play by Zimi Motokiyo, the greatest dramatist and theorist of the Japanese no theater. The play, which takes its name from the protective railing around a well, is framed within an encounter between a Buddhist monk and a village woman, who tells the monk a story. Highly stylized, the play is based on a visionary no story of a boy and girl who meet at a well, fall in love, and marry. Le Morte d'Arthur. Sir Thomas Malory. Printed by William Caxton in 1485, although an earlier manuscript version from around 1470 exists, Le Morte d'Arthur is a compilation of stories about the legendary King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. Deriving from older French romances, the stories were translated into English prose and compiled by English knight, soldier, writer, and Member of Parliament Sir Thomas Malory. Malory arranged the stories in chronological order, starting with the birth of Arthur, and chose to focus on the brotherhood of the knights rather than the theme of courtly love so popular with the French. Therein stuck a fair sword naked by the point. Whoso pulleth out this sword of this stone and anvil, is rightwise king born of all England. Le Morte d'Arthur, Sir Thomas Malory. Amadis of Gaul. Garci Rodriguez de Montalvo. A chivalric prose romance written in Spanish by Montalvo, Amadis of Gaul probably had its origins in the early 14th century, but its original date and authorship is uncertain. Written in 4 volumes, Montalvo's version recounts the story of Amadis, a handsome, valiant, yet gentle knight, and his love for Princess Oriana, in whose service he undertakes chivalric adventures and bold feats against giants and monsters. Its high ideals, gallantry, and romance set the standard for chivalric works that followed. The Barcas Trilogy. Gil Vicente. A devotional work, The Barcas Trilogy by Portuguese playwright Gil Vicente. Often described as the father of Portuguese drama, consists of 3 one-act plays, The Ship of Hell, The Ship of Purgatory, and The Ship of Heaven. Satirical and allegorical, these 3 plays, which together are considered Vicente's most masterful work, portray the passengers, who reflect all classes of Lisbon society, and their mainly unsuccessful attempts to enter heaven. The Lusíads. Luís de Camões. Often regarded as Portugal's national epic, The Lusíads is a 10-canto epic poem by the great Portuguese poet de Camões recounting Vasco da Gama's sea route to India. After the introduction, an invocation to river gods, and a dedication to King Sebastian, the poem includes orations by a series of narrators, including a history of Portugal, recounted by da Gama, as well as descriptions of adventures, storms, and interventions by Greco-Roman gods. Overall, it is a homage to the Portuguese and their achievements. The Faerie Queene. Edmund Spenser. The defining work of English poet Spenser, and one of the great long poems of the English language, The Faerie Queene is a religious, moral, and political allegory. Set in a mythical Arthurian world, symbolizing Tudor England, the poem consists of 6 books,